Hi, I'm Skinny Cheeks. This video will be an update to the Bloody Warden build. I don't typically do themed builds, usually I just concentrate on the meta, but I do enjoy when you can get very close to meta-like results with something that is a little bit different. If you are looking for a more traditional Warden setup for the Lost Depths patch, I definitely recommend checking out Luca Cash's videos. He's done one for both Magicka and Stamina Warden. Unfortunately, the top-end Warden performance does seem a little behind the pack comparing to the rest of the classes for this patch. I will also add in a bonus easy static rotation for a traditional non-bleed focused Warden build at the end of this video. It's super simple and can get really nice results still, but I won't be focusing on the specifics of that style of setup throughout this video. However, all of the combat metrics reports will be available after each parse, as well as some additional ones on the website at skinnycheeks.gg. But back to the Bloody Warden setup, which is what we'll go over in this video. Relative to what the Warden can top out at, this build is actually not too far off. This will be a stamina focused build, and I'll go through both a traditional 2-bar setup as well as an Oakensoul 1-bar setup. And lastly, before we get started, I do highly recommend you check out my guide to the trial dummy before practicing to make sure that you are optimized there. It may look like DPS has gone up for you a little this patch, but in reality there were several buffs added to the trial dummy, which can be a bit misleading if you don't know what you're looking for. So I'll go ahead and link that video down in the description below. And with that all out of the way, let's go ahead and get into it. First off, let's cover some of the key changes from the last time we went over this. So Cutting Dive no longer stacks up really high in bleed damage during off-balance periods. Instead, it now offers a 10-second bleed dot during non-off-balance periods. So what that means is that the high-end potential of this skill has come down quite a bit, but for casual use, if you weren't really paying attention to the off-balance period anyways, the skill will likely give somewhat similar results, maybe a tad bit lower than what you were used to before. One positive takeaway from this is that the uptime on the bleed is now much higher. You previously were topping out around 50% or so uptime on that bleed, but now you can get that much higher. The extra uptime synergizes really well with the main set that we'll be using in this build, Dro'zakar's Claws. And I also wanted to quickly cover a common misconception with this skill and also with the skill Carve. I saw a lot of people thinking that because those two bleeds used to stack up in damage, that those additional stacks counted as extra damage for Dro'zakar, but they actually only ever counted as one bleed each. Both Carve and Cutting Dive were each just one unique instance of bleed damage. The amount they ticked for just increased with these additional stacks. So now that Carve is just a longer duration at 3 stacks and Cutting Dive is just one bleed, this does not have a negative effect on how well they work with Dro'zakar. If anything, they work slightly better for it now because they have better uptimes. And then one of the other big changes going on this patch is with a lot of the dot durations. They've changed a lot of the timers, so I did have to make a new static rotation for this. If you're doing dynamic, then the principles are still pretty much the same, you just have different timers to watch, but for the static version, we've changed up the order of things a bit. And then the last change I'll cover really quick is to the Advanced Species passive. This was hit pretty hard, and instead of a % boost, it now offers penetration. One positive takeaway from this though is that the build actually ends up with the light armor penetration levels, even though we are going with the medium armor build. So what this means is that for dungeons or trials where there aren't additional penetration debuff sets going, you could bring in this setup and still hit right near that pin cap. Those % boosts that we had before were definitely preferred, but the penetration is not wasted in all scenarios, though it will be for some. And then there were a few other changes, but I'll go through those as we go through the build as we get to those particular points in each section we discuss. Alright, let's go over the gear now. We'll start with the 2-bar setup. There are a few good ways to run this. A 1-piece Slime Craw and the Harpooner's Waiting Kilt is a very strong combo to use, especially if you need help reaching the crit damage cap. And then there's a ton of other mythics that you could also use in place of the kilt, so this setup would work the same with those, you just move some pieces around a little bit. But another option, and what I did on the trial dummy, is go for a 2-piece monster set instead of the 1-piece monster set and mythic. Since we have Elemental Catalyst now on the dummy, it's super easy to hit the crit damage cap even without the kilt, but that may or may not be the case depending on your group for actual content. Zon, Selene, and Kjolnar's all gave me pretty similar results. I think Selene is pretty cool for the Warden theme since you already have the bear out, so get a few extra bonus points for style there going with Selene. For our always active set, we want Dro'zakar's Claws. We've talked about this a little already, but it really synergizes well with the Warden as they have access to more bleeds than any other class. So depending on what set you end up pairing this with, you'll have 7 or 8 bleeds going, and that is going to be capping out between 721 and 824 weapon and spell damage for that 5-piece bonus. And I'm not adding in the 129 weapon damage that's already on the 5-piece either, so we do have a stamina recovery bonus on the 4-piece. So essentially I'm kind of looking at that as a wash and just moving that 5-piece bonus over to that, and we're just looking at what is added by the bleeds alone. And I get this question sometimes. This is affected by all of your normal modifiers like major and minor sorcery and brutality, and any other percent boost for weapon and spell damage like from your medium armor, your fighter skills, etc. So typically this will end up well over 1000 weapon and spell damage added for that 5-piece bonus. Now remember, this damage is just to the targets that have the specific bleeds on them. This doesn't go straight to your stat sheet, so it won't affect your heals or anything like that, and won't affect in an AoE to targets that don't have the bleeds, just to the main target that you have every bleed on. If you have some bleeds on side targets, they'll take some increased damage, but not the full amount. So that's just something to keep in mind when you are using this setup. A nice alternative to Dro'zakar here is the Blooddrinker set for the 2-bar build. I found this to be inferior to Dro'zakar as we still have a lot of our damage coming from non-bleed abilities, and Dro'zakar will boost those too since you are just getting increased overall damage based on how many bleeds you have. But there is still a high enough percentage of our damage coming from bleeds that the 20% damage increase from Blooddrinker is a solid option here. Just didn't quite get as much as Dro'zakar did for me. For our front bar set, Relequen is the option that got me the highest results. Now this is just for pure single target damage, so another option that could be really good here is Whirl of the Depths. This one has really nice AoE and is not too far behind on single target either. Just make sure that you aren't using it on fights where the bosses are moving constantly, as you might miss a lot of the whirlpools that drops, and that's a huge DPS loss with this set. And then the third option here for the front bar set is to go with Pillar of Nirn. This does seem a tad bit lower because you miss out on having that minor slayer bonus that you'd get from the other 2 trial sets, but the Pillar of Nirn proc does count as an extra bleed for Dro'zakar, pushing you up to 8 bleeds active for that set. So it actually ends up being not very far behind Relequen, and might even be better for some fights where you can't effectively keep up those Relequen stacks, but in that scenario I think that Whirl of the Depths is probably still the better option, but it might just depend on how much movement there is as well. Overall though, all of these combos work well. Some might just be a little better in some scenarios than others. And then finally, for our back bar set, you definitely want that Maelstrom 2-hander. If you have the perfected one, that's cool. If not, it really doesn't make a difference, and it makes 0 difference on the trial dummy as we are already at the penetration cap. The proc from the Maelstrom 2-hander was nerfed, but it does still count as a bleed towards our Dro'zakar set, so it's really nice to have to add on to that. So this is what my specific set ended up looking like that got me 114k DPS. As I mentioned, I went with no mythic and just a 2-piece monster set here. And I also did 2 light pieces because of certain skills I ran here, and I needed a little Magicka sustain help, but depending on what you end up running exactly, if your sustain is fine, then 1 light and 1 medium on the monster set works really well there. And then I also did the same test with Selene. It was very close in damage, only a few hundred DPS behind. Selene is only single target while Zon is AoE, but Selene would be a bit more reliable since it is guaranteed damage, and Zon relies on chance and can break if the tether gets too far from the enemy, and then you have to wait on a long cooldown. And as I mentioned before, Kjolnir works really great there too. Its only downside is that only one person in the group can wear it at a time, as the stacks from it work as a debuff on the enemy. Alright, now let's go over the Oakensoul setup. We're using a 1-piece slime crawl here for the monster set. Since a mythic is required with Oakensoul, we don't have the luxury of doing a 2-piece monster set with this kind of setup. You could also do a monster set with penetration here if you find yourself too low. For the first 5-piece set, I actually found with this particular setup, Blooddrinker was a little better than the Dro'zakar set. This is because with less skills, due to only having 1 bar, a way higher percentage of those skills ends up being bleed damage, and we do end up 2 bleeds short compared to the 2 2-bar setup for Dro'zakar, since instead of using two-hander and dual wield, we can only use one or the other. Dro'zakar was still pretty decent here. It seemed like a solid option. It just wasn't doing quite as much as Blooddrinker was. Moving on to our second 5-piece set, we're going to go with Pillar of Nirn. This is great here as Oakensoul now adds Minor Slayer, so we don't have to have a trial set going for that. And Pillar also gets boosted by Blooddrinker for an additional 20% damage to that. So that's some pretty nice synergy between the two sets there. And so this is the exact setup I ended up running for my 90k parse with the 1-bar build. Pretty straightforward overall, and I'll have this particular parse as well as some for the 2-bar setups at the end of the video. Alright, now let's cover the skills. We'll start with the 2-bar setup again. First is Barbed Trap. Must have skill for this build. It is okay damage for the skill itself, but it is bleed damage and it has a very high chance to also proc hemorrhaging. So having that high uptime on hemorrhaging will also greatly benefit Dro'zakar. And it also gives you 10% crit damage with Minor Force. Just a really great skill. Next up, we have Deep Fissure. I'm going with the Magicamorph here for a few reasons. First, it has really nice debuffs on it, both Major and Minor Breach. Those can be unnecessary at times, but even if you only end up slightly adding to the uptimes on these, it can make a big difference. Also, since it costs Magicka, this can greatly help our stamina sustain. You can use Subterranean Assault here, but just make sure you tweak for your sustain as it will be way more stam intensive. Next up is Rending Slashes. This is an okay dot, but it does count as a bleed towards Dro'zakar, and it has a guarantee to proc hemorrhaging whenever you cast it. And then next up is Cutting Dive. This will be our main spammable with this build. I especially prefer this if you're using a dynamic rotation, because Bloodthirst or Rapid Strikes can be a little annoying to bar swap off of due to their channel times. Also, the Cutting Dive bleed counts towards Dro'zakar, whereas Bloodthirst is not a dot, even though it is bleed damage. Bloodthirst does get boosted by the Blooddrinker set though, so maybe if you're running that instead, just something to keep in mind there. And then finally on our front bar we have Deadly Cloak. This doesn't really do anything special for our bleed setup, but it's just a nice dot and it adds in some nice protection with Major Evasion. This can be dropped if you need a specific skill that isn't listed here though. Then for our ultimate we have Wild Guardian. This is the bleed morph that will also help to keep up really high hemorrhaging uptimes. Now for the back bar we have Growing Swarm. This is a little bit weaker for single target damage than the other Magicamorph, but it is a bleed and it counts towards Dro'zakar or Blooddrinker, and it also damages in an AoE, whereas the other morph is purely single target. And then we have Stampede as our main back bar ground dot. This will keep up our back bar enchantment as well as proc our Maelstrom two-hander bleed. Next up is Carve. This is another bleed dot, really strong regardless of your build, but especially using Dro'zakar or Blooddrinker. Then the next two skills are kind of up to you. These are by far the most flexible spots in this build if you have something you really need for a specific encounter. I really like Winter's Revenge here in this first one. It's a nice AoE dot and it has a high chance to proc Chilled. That Chilled part isn't a huge deal if you already have someone in your group taking care of that, but it does add in 10% crit damage for us through our Warden passives. Now that's a separate buff from Minor Brittle. That one only comes from adding Chilled with an Ice Staff, and that's for everyone. This is a separate Warden specific buff, and this just comes from Chilled being on the target. So depending on what your group has or doesn't have, you might get a little more crit damage from this. On the trial dummy, it does not count it for some reason as having Chilled, so providing our own Chilled does give us 10% more crit damage. And then for the final spot here, I did a few different things on some different parses, but on my highest one I ended up using Arctic Blast here, which also has a high chance to proc Chilled just like Winter's Revenge does. I found with both of these skills going together, I consistently had over 90% uptime on my Chilled status, which meant I had more flexibility to not run the kilt or to not run a crit damage champion point node. Arctic Blast is also a really nice self-heal. The biggest downside to this ability is that it is super expensive. If you remember earlier, I said I ended up needing to go with 2 light pieces, and this skill is the reason that I did that. If you aren't too worried about getting higher Chilled uptimes and you don't care about having this there for a heal, you can definitely swap that out for a cheaper costing skill like Degeneration or whatever you need really. It will be a flexible spot for you. And then without this here, you shouldn't need 2 light pieces. You can probably go back to 1. Another option here for these 2 last spots would be to run either your Netch or Degeneration in one of them, and then one of the Lotus Flower morphs in the second spot, and then that would take care of both of your major buffs that you'd normally get from potions, allowing you to run tri-potions, heroism potions, or whatever other option you might want to go with. And then if this setup is a few too many skills for you to keep up with and you wanted something a little bit more simple, I did an easier version as well. I'll go through the rotations for both of these setups later, but essentially you just have a couple less dots to keep up with, so it's just a little easier to perform. Mostly the same, except Deadly Cloak and Arctic Blast are dropped and you just double bar Camo Hunter instead. And then in that Carve spot, you can run Carve there if you already have your major sorcery brutality covered from either potions or a teammate, or you can run Degeneration there if you need that buff. You could also run your Netch there for this, like we talked about earlier. It is kind of nice being able to pre-buff this instead of needing a target like Degeneration does, but for longer fights such as on the Trial Dummy, I found it better to have a skill that's actually doing damage while also taking care of that buff. But the Netch can be nice as well if you're having some sustain issues. And then finally we have our 1-bar Oakensoul setup. We are running Cutting Dive here, but we're actually not running it as our main spammable, but instead for its 10-second bleed dot. It's a little annoying that it only applies when off balance is not present, so sometimes you may cast it and the dot doesn't trigger, but it's not the end of the world as it still has a strong upfront hit to it since it is generally used as a spammable, though not as strong as our main spammable hit, which we'll go over in a second. And then again, we're going with the Deep Fissure morph. With all of our other skills costing stamina, I just don't see how Sub-Assault could be sustained in this particular setup. I'm not sure I'd prefer it anyways, even if it could be sustained. And then we have Rending Slashes again for the bleed and guaranteed hemorrhaging proc. And then our main spammable here is going to be Bloodthirst from the dual wield skill line. This spammable hits super hard. It has a fairly strong heal built into it. It synergizes really well with the Blooddrinker set, and it also gets an extra 20% more damage in execute due to our dual wield passives. And since we don't ever have to bar swap, with this being an Oakensoul build, that 0.8 second channel doesn't feel nearly as awkward to play around. And then finally we have Growing Swarm. This is again here so that we have another bleed dot, and it isn't an AoE, which is something this build is missing a bit of. This particular version with the dual wield is very single target heavy aside from our Deep Fissure and the Swarm. So if you wanted to keep the theme but have a bit more AoE, or maybe something to swap back and forth between trash and bosses, you can swap to a two-handed front bar instead of dual wield here. Then most of the build is the same. You just drop Rending Slashes for Stampede and Bloodthirst for Carve, and then you use Carve as your main AoE spammable and Cutting Dive as your single target spammable. Both of these setups will work great, but the dual wield version should get a little bit more single target damage. All right, next up, we'll cover the rotations. As always, a fully dynamic rotation will allow for the highest results. This is what Luca Cash is doing in the videos that I mentioned in the opening and what I used for my 114k parse. We are precasting Deadly Cloak and Arctic Blast. If you aren't running Arctic Blast, you can just skip that there. And then we'll cast our Deep Fissure, and we'll start our light attack weaving with Stampede, Winter's Revenge, and then bar swap to the front and cast Rending Slashes. This will also ensure that the first hit from our Deep Fissure lands on our front bar, so that's why we aren't just casting all of our back bar dots in a row there. And then we'll cast Barbed Trap, bar swap back, and cast Growing Swarm and Carve. Then we have all of our dots applied, so we can cast our Bear Ult, Cutting Dive, and then reapply Deep Fissure. After that, we start spamming our Cutting Dive and then just reapply all of our dots as they run out. You'll see I'm running in place here. I did turn on auto run, and I'd like doing this when I'm doing a dynamic rotation because Stampede will gray your bars out unless you're moving. So instead of having to do a little wiggle each time before I cast Stampede, with testing lots of setups, it's easier to just have auto run and not to have to worry about that. In static rotations, I always pair a skill with Stampede to cast right after it, so you don't have to worry about doing this. And so this is the specific setup that got 114k, and I'll show the full thing at the end of the video. For the static rotation, I found that Arctic Blast was unsustainable here since we are overcasting Winter's Revenge by 2 seconds to keep it static. But similar opening, we are pre-buffing our Deadly Cloak, and then we enter the static rotation. It will just be Deep Fissure, Stampede, Winter's Revenge, Rending Slashes. Again, we're swapping to the front bar here so that Deep Fissure pops on our front bar. And then Growing Swarm, Degeneration, Carve, Barbed Trap, and a couple of spams. The first time through, the first 10 seconds here, you'll do a bear ult in place of one of those spams. And then for the second 10-second portion, we do Deep Fissure, Stampede, and Winter's Revenge again. That repeats the same every 10 seconds, but then we'll have 6 spammables in the second portion of this here. Then we'll reapply Deadly Cloak, and then the whole thing just repeats. Just the first time through, you will need to replace one of those spammables with Carve, since you do only have one stack of Carve at that point, so it is only lasting 12 seconds at this point instead of 32 seconds. So if you wait until the first half of the rotation again and don't refresh it, it is going to run out and you'll be back at square one. But after that initial run through, you just repeat this same 20 seconds over and over. The only thing you have to really pay attention to is your ultimate. Just make sure to replace one of your spammable casts with your bear ult whenever that's ready. So it definitely isn't perfect. Generally, static rotations don't line up everything perfectly unless you overcast things quite a bit, which is what we had to do here. Especially Stampede, we're casting it every 10 seconds instead of 15. This does give you a little leeway if you are a little bit slower in your rotation, or if maybe there's a lot of movement and you would have to overcast Stampede anyways. So it's not the end of the world. It does have an okay upfront hit as well, so it isn't a complete loss to overcast it early, but it's definitely not ideal. I didn't really see a good way to avoid that while doing a static rotation. You could potentially set up something as long as a 60-second static rotation maybe, but at that point you're pretty much just doing it dynamically. 30 seconds is usually kind of my limit for what I'll want to map out as a static style. And then there's another option if you want to kind of move towards a somewhat dynamic rotation but with mostly static, so you could keep up your Carve just dynamically and replace one of your cutting dives with it before it runs out each time. That would eliminate overcasting Carve every 20 seconds, as you'd have another like 10 seconds or so window to play with there for more spammables instead of casting Carve every 20 seconds. Definitely an option if you feel more comfortable keeping that up dynamically. And then, as I mentioned in the skills section, we do have an easier version. It's just the same thing pretty much. We just have less skills to keep up with. So we precast our Deep Fissure, and then we start our light attack weaving with Stampede and Winter's Revenge. Bar swap to the front, so Deep Fissure pops on the front bar, cast Rending and Barbed Trap. And then back bar for Swarm and Carve. Then we have time for 3 spammables. The first time through again, we'll replace the first one with our ultimate. And then we'll go do our Deep Fissure, Stampede, and Winter's Revenge. These are all 3 always paired together. And then time for 7 spammables. And like the last rotation, you'll want to replace one of those with Carve so that it doesn't run out. In this 20-second section, we'll just repeat over and over. And then like I just talked about with the previous rotation, you could always pair Growing Swarm and Carve together, or you can do Carve dynamically just in place of one of your spams. Just make sure you hit it before it runs out. Same idea here if you're running Degeneration. Instead of Carve, you could just pair it with Growing Swarm, or it does have a little bit longer timer than Swarm. It's 24 seconds instead of 20, so if you wanted to keep that up dynamically as well, that is an option. And then with your Bear Ultimate, same as the other rotation, you'll just want to replace one of your spammables with that whenever it's ready. So for the final rotation I'll show, I mentioned in the opening I'd have a bonus clip at the end of the video for a non-Dro'zakar setup. So this will be what I used in that final bonus parse. It is essentially the same rotation. I've just replaced Winter's Revenge with the Screaming Cliff Racer, since that gives you a nice weapon and spell damage buff now. And I replaced Cutting Dive on the front bar with Rapid Strikes. Since it is static, it's set up in a way where we don't have to bar swap off of Rapid Strikes. And then you could still do Winter's Revenge as well instead of Cutting Dive there if you wanted. You could also do a Flame or an Ice Staff and run Unstable Wall instead of Stampede there. Pretty easy rotation overall, and not too far off from what a dynamic rotation can offer. And then finally, here are the results for all of the different setups that I tested. I won't show video clips for each of these, as some are essentially the same with just a different monster helm or something like that. So I'll just show the ones that actually have differing rotations, but I'll have this linked on my website and you can dig through it if you want and check out the combat metrics reports for each individual setup. That's it. That's the build. Thanks a bunch for stopping by. If you haven't already subscribed to the channel, it definitely helps out a ton. Hopefully this build works out great for you. Let me know if you've already used the previous Bloody Warden build that we had in the past, or if you have something similar that you run that gets you really good results. A big thanks to my current Patreon supporters and YouTube members. Link is in the description if you're interested in helping out that way. And a special thanks to Nicholas, Simon, Cougar's Bay and the Cougar City Guild, the Order of War Guild, Iffy, Cantankerous Cat, Shady, Blake1816, Mordecai1212, Santanico, Nilandia, Florian, Vidridi, Cha-Cha, and Unemployed. Thanks again for stopping by. I'll close this out with several parses from some of the different setups. I'll see y'all in the next one. Bye.